In 2015, Roads Must Fall tweeted that the Pitt Rivers is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford. It was then, and it is now. Moreover, as we wrote late last year, we still believe that the Pitt Rivers Museum is an imperial institution, as well as a matter of historical as well as contemporary fact. It was set up to archive artifacts gathered under imperial conditions. We do not think that enough has been done to highlight to visitors where the placement of objects is objectionable to Indigenous and other colonised peoples. Inaccuracies in descriptions remain uncorrected. Some claim that the Pitt Rivers is a museum of a museum, a reminder of what old colonial museums used to be. Yet the fact that almost nothing in the museum indicates this to visitors means it is harder for us to say that the museum serves a positive educational purpose. We still believe that a fuller reckoning with objects on display, how they are arranged, and how they are described remains urgent. For these reasons, we wrestled, and are still wrestling, with whether to let Common Ground be associated with the museum officially. While we are here today, and thank Dan for letting us use the space, we are also here with a significant degree of discomfort and unease. What we are clear on is that the Pitt Rivers, alongside Oriel and All Souls, stands at the very heart of Oxford's historic history with exploitation. And so, as we begin to attempt to renew pressure, begun by previous campaigns, for reparative justice and then end of continuing relationships of exploitation between Oxford and the world, the Pitt Rivers is perhaps the most appropriate place to be.
My name's Michelle Codrington-Rogers and I'm going to be chairing the event tonight. And just a really short introduction to me. For those of you who don't know me or those of you who've seen me before, I'm not going to go over it all again, but there's a reason why I'm linked to the work that Common Ground are doing and the Roads Must Fall campaign in Oxfordshire. As some of you may know, you might have spotted my surname as Codrington, and my family have got a link to the Codrington Library, not the white part of the Codrington family who dedicated the library, but links to the slaves whose wealth of the Codrington family was built off of the back of my ancestors. So I managed, through Kesmet, I ended up growing up in Oxford, and it was through the work of the Roads Must Fall campaign and the Common Ground campaign as well that we've managed to meet in the middle in this space at this time. And it's been a partnership that has given us all a chance to have a think about where Oxfordshire's legacy is and how it's impacted not just on students at the university and not just at students after they've left the university, not just on the families who've dedicated money or donated money built off the back of colonialisation, exploitation, but it's also started us to think and to talk about the impact it has on the Oxford community. And that's why I think this event is so special, because this event is bringing together the university, which exists because of the communities in Oxfordshire, but also bringing together the community as well. And so you're going to hear from people with their feet in either or both camps. Hopefully the most important thing is to get you to think about the space that we exist within Oxfordshire, because a lot of Oxford people don't think about being linked between the town and the gown, or between the gown and the town, but actually it's all created this space where we are today. So hopefully today you'll have an opportunity to think about what this means. And I think the introduction earlier was brilliant about the fact that it's a complex, it's an uncomfortable, it's a contradictory, it's a difficult space. And as somebody who's grown up in Oxford, who knows that there are relics in this building that are from the island where my family are from, which doesn't have its own museum. It has a space which has got very little in there, but it doesn't have its own revered museum. This is part of an ongoing debate, an ongoing discussion, and it is one that we must have. And hopefully this evening will help contribute to that. So there will be time, there will be space for discussion, there will be time and space for question and answer, but there'll also be kind of stimulating, thought-provoking, hopefully kind of get you kind of thinking about what this space means. So we're going to start this evening with a presentation by Princess, who's going to come and address and kind of give you something to think about. So Princess.
My name is Princess Peace, so that's like the name I go by. I'm currently in my final year at Magdalen. So the reason that I'm kind of here and the piece that I'm going to do, and actually I'm going to do two pieces, but the first piece, so I was one of the campaigners, I guess the co-organising members, I guess you could say, for the Rose Must Fall campaign. So it's kind of nice to kind of see that, like, despite like early kind of campaigners kind of moving on, that there's still a form of these discussions kind of continuing. So I'll perform or read out a bit of both. A poem that I wrote that was mainly meant to address, I guess, the discussions and the arguments that kind of became slightly irritating hearing as like being one of the campaigners, and you're addressing people trying to talk about Rose Must Fall and why the movement exists. And then there's certain, I guess, ways of thinking that you come across that you just keep coming across, and I felt that as much as it was important that we had rational discussions, I realized that there was an element, almost as what Ms. Codrington was saying, that there's an element of people kind of taking out the, I guess, the emotion part of it, the actual individual stories and how it impacts people on like that kind of human level. And I think for me, writing this was like me attempting to kind of bring that back to the heart of like discussions. So it's called Ignorance Must Fall, and it's addressed in like a letter format. Dear ignorance, see, I have a problem with the word imperialist. From time, imperial can be synonymized with regal, majestic, and sovereign. You can go ahead and miss me with that imperialist bull quick, because Rhodes didn't regally rob my people, neither did he majestically murder the masses of bodies now found lying in unmarked graves, identities turned into commodities to feed your steeples, blood money from slave roads held colonies built, your paved roads. But please, tell me, what deity died to give you the audacity to claim to have sovereignty over my people? Rhodes said he prefers land to niggers, guessing that's why he and other colonizers like him plowed the black earth of our skin, making fertile his colonial legacies. See, it wasn't enough that the world was his chessboard, see, he got bored and had to pull for all the pieces too. Rhodes must fall for every diamond-encrusted tear that was stolen, every home and black body that was ever broken, used as a token, all under the banner of empire. So let's just tell it how it is. And the truth is this. Rhodes was a glorified murderer, pedestal-raised butcher, and only a few words more that I was never raised to utter. But you continuously fail to recognize your classy lies, because your utopia was built on the hands of the fallen. So you think you can smirk in my face, reflecting your ignorance to the plight of my race when I tell you we should decolonize Oxford. But like I said, you can go ahead and miss me with that imperialist bull quick. Now let's move on to the movement. See, society would have you believe we've moved on from colonialism. Nobody wants to understand that it's a structural prism. See, some mentalities are built on the privilege you were given. Others are built on the realities of the privilege you weren't living till you're perpetually stuck in your society's prison. Oh, it's easy to acknowledge Oxford is steeped in tradition, but when you're in it, not so much to accept that it's a one-sided rendition. A narrative told from a magnifying glass ceiling. See the quick call to colonize our education. Hear the fighting white tears to keep our miseducation. So a further ignorant few say, we're erasing history. But I'd like to point out our restoration of an unspoken narrative erased from the fabrication of his story as a benefactor and politician, a man with a singularly business-minded mission. Just type Rhodes into your search bar and let me show you how we've created new roads of discussion. Open the history onto the book never spoken, because we're flipping the tail and flipping the switch onto the side of a truth unspoken. Hashtag Rhodes must fall, hashtag Rhodes is falling. Sincerely yours, Princess Peace. Thank you. I guess the example you could use is that the flappings of a butterfly wings, the effect of that could cause a hurricane or a typhoon somewhere else. And I guess in writing this, it was me trying to kind of, I guess you could say it's the fact that I realized that we don't all live single issue lives. Like when something happens on a personal level, things are happening on a political level, things are happening to do with climate change, things are happening to do with racism and classism, and everything's kind of happening at once at the same time simultaneously. And how do you capture that and encompass that within a piece? And so this was me trying to like address that, and it's based on the year 2018. So it's called The Butterfly Effect. It's 2018. The year where everything connects, where politics don't collide to divide a nation, instead just show the divided cracks already hiding inside its population. We abide by the rules of a government system still coded in the ashes of its Grenfell Tower victims and the survivors still unhoused to resist them. A washing machine year caught in the cycle of its predecessors, where shadows cast by the sun are the predictions of another fallen body in a city of lost boys whose lives are barely lived and yet are lost without a lifeline, who run with samurai swords for arms, engaging in mortal combat where the only option seems to be become a dead man walking or a part of the walking dead. Somewhere with tears in her eyes, a mother with a Nagato-shaped gravestone in the place of a heart watches the memories of her child dance at death's door. Like Michonne, she's fighting to learn how to breathe again. It's 2018, a year where Black Panthers were marveled at and the right and left-wing Twitterverse collided, where Project Madeline still finds more funding from the magic money tree we're still yet to see, but which remembers to rear its voice when the topic of immigrants are propaganda fattened and force-fed into our mouths without choice. Till we spit out the broken bones of Brexit teeth, shoulders sunken with no confidence in our leadership. It's the butterfly effect, it's how everything connects, political lies exposed with one breath till the wind rushed in and the wind rushed out and blew a whole generation away in the next. It's how the education system sometimes feel like my left lung collapsing when university deadlines press like clockwork and depression hits my back with each panic attack. It's 2018. Where the World Cup happens and France wins the title, but I've stopped watching football with my father now. Family fishes break footy traditions, forcing me to celebrate over a phone call I hoped would never be picked up. It's 2018, where gentrification is on the rise and the sterling is still seen as great, of course only vilified when it wears red and belongs to a black face. But racism in football is just a microcosm of society, so really the media's pitchfork headlines have never quite surprised me. It's 2018. The world watches on as ice caps melt, a visual reflection of last year's Paris Accords. Oil spills on my mother's kitchen floor and Newfoundland oil still pumps across the ocean shore. At home, I pick and peel apart the flesh of an orange in my hand. I watch its citrus spray float across the transatlantic where a different type of orange sits in a house of white in Washington, where its policies peel apart the entwined fingers of mothers from their children. The sound of a siren is universal. 1,000 hearts beat in fear at hearing it ring across the favelas, the ghettos, the Sowetos, the inner city heartbeat, where justice is as easily discarded as the peeled rinds of orange flesh on a market street. It's 2018, the year where everything connects across the globe. Black and brown bodies still get pressed into concrete, into cells, into patted down dirt, into an earth which has rejected their gravestones. But autumn has passed now and winter is coming. We've lost loved ones and learned not to ask for whom the bell tolls. In a hospital somewhere, new lives are emerging. Our collective breaths soon halt in unison, staring into the peaceful heart of a chaos where the future resides. We await the end of a year not so different from the ones that have passed. Another 2000 and something where the 12 o'clock countdown ushers in another spin of fate's wheel and we see the world tilt on its axis. But it's still 2018, and that's where this time capsule of a poem rests, caught between the soon-seen typhoon wings of the butterfly effect. Princess Peace. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Zad, and I'm a writer, performer, director. And the piece that I'm going to do today is actually not exactly an extract, but like sort of a taster from a wider show that's going to be happening at the North Wall. That's done by an all-BAME cast and crew. So North Wall from the 30th of May to the 1st of June, called My Mother Runs in Zigzags, which is about the stories that our families and our communities pass on to us, and the way that these stories, often stories of trauma, stories of migration, stories of war, exist within our lives and the way the past exists today with us. So it's about intergenerational trauma. It's also about how these stories are told and cut down in ways that make them more manageable or like easy to accept and understand, which is also what happens with history in general. And the entirety of the show is based on real stories told by the parents of our cast and crew to us, their children, as second, third generation migrants. Now, my mother is a survivor of the Lebanese Civil War, She came to Europe as a refugee when I was a baby. And she doesn't talk very much or have very many like facial expressions. She says mainly like, the main thing she says is, That's what she said when I said, oh no, I'm gonna write a play about you. And she said, Or says this, and she says a few stories. There are about 4 or 5 stories that she says all the time. She says them like fairy tales. Like, I know them like I know like Cinderella or Despicable Me. And they're always about things that happened during the Lebanese Civil War, but they're always also really funny. And they come at random moments. I'll be walking home from school with like all the like nice little well-ordered trees, and suddenly it's like, the war, isn't this hilarious? And there's a specific one that always comes up when it's anyone's birthday. My mother is not a very joyful woman, so she doesn't like birthdays at all. Specifically, she doesn't like her birthday because she doesn't know when her birthday was. So every time a birthday comes up, she tells me this story. She calls the story of the wardrobe. Now, with some music written originally for this show. So, when my grandmother had children, with every child she had, she carved the name of the child on a little old dingy wardrobe in this house in Beirut. So, name of the child and the birth date. Tariq, 13th of January. Faraj, 16th of June. May, 25th of May. Juman, that's my mother's name. Well, what happened was, when my mother was 2 years old, Beirut was divided into 2. One bit for the Christians, one bit for the Muslims. Now, the house with the wardrobe in it was in the Christian bit, but the people who lived in the house were Muslims. So what happened was, the house was burnt, and with it, the wardrobe, and with it, my mother's birthday. So, whenever she says this, she laughs. She doesn't laugh that often, but she laughs when she says this. And we have a discussion about it. And we've decided at the moment that she must have been born on the 8th of January and not the 17th of December. These are the 2 options based on like different family members' opinions. Because if she was born on the 17th of December, she would be a Sagittarius, and they're fun, so. And that's normally where the story ends. And only once, did she say the rest of the story, which was, the house was burnt. And my grandmother, my mother says, is a very extroverted woman. And she has many, many friends and is always talking to everyone. So when she's in the Muslim area, she's like a hijabi and she's gone to Hajj and everything. But when she's in the Christian area, she's like, has a miniskirt and loves Jesus. So she had many Christian friends. And house being burnt, she takes all her children, 10, the youngest, my mother, 3 years old, the oldest, Faraj, 13. She takes them all to her friend's house, which is not that wise because it's still in the middle of the war and still not pretentious. And the children go up to the attic. And then they're looking outside the window and seeing what's going on. And my mother says, you can see everyone coming out of the houses in these lines with their hands like this, like in these films with the Nazis, everyone like that. So they're watching this, and Faraj, the oldest, 13 years old, who is also a member of the militia, as are all teenagers in this period, has a gun. He's looking at this and he's not happy. So he starts shooting out of the window. And the soldiers not naturally notice and shoot back. He turns around when they're shooting back and they shoot him straight in the bum. Can you believe it? Straight in the bum. And she says this, laughing, and she says this and says, I always knew he was a pain in the ass, but not like this. Anyway, so he's attracted attention from everyone. So the soldiers come into the house. They bring the children, one by one. And they line them up against the wall. The youngest, my mother, 3 years old. The oldest, my uncle, 13 years old. They're all lined up against the wall. The soldiers point their guns at them and say, put your hands up. Put your hands up.
I'm going to pass over to Dan Hicks. And Dan, I'm going to read a bit of his biog. Dan's going to give us a kind of I guess from a different perspective, the impact of colonialisation, empire, and kind of memorialising, isn't it, really, and legacy. I'm just going to say that he is the Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at the University of Oxford, and he's also a curator here at Pitt Rivers. And I think he's the best person to kind of add another kind of layer to this discussion and this exploration that we're having today. So I'm going to hand over to Dan.
For someone that's worked in this institution for a little more than 10 years to, you know, to have heard the contributions we've had already and the poets and, you know, to have you all here. It isn't the sort of space that you can really welcome people into, but I'm really interested in, and a lot of us in the museum sector are very interested in, the status of museums as a sort of a public space, not as a one-way space where education is going, where we have all the answers, but a space for dialogue and a space that we can open up in a range of different ways. And I think, I mean, a lot of my work has been around the legacies of empire. So, you know, what I've been asked really to talk about are questions over restoration and, you know, repatriation and the restitution and how we're thinking about those issues as a museum at the Pitt Rivers. And so welcome. And I think, you know, just before I do that, I mean, just to underline that an event like this really reminds me and all of us, I'm sure, of, you know, what we know academically, you know, to be true, which is the sense that a space of this kind, and indeed more generally the space, the way in which this space shows us something which is more generally true about the University of Oxford, which is the fact that empire is not, we're not in, if you like, the post-colonial world, wherein what Anne Laura Stoller refers to as sort of not the post-colonial ruin, but the ongoing processes of the ruination which were enacted under empire. So, you know, the processes that led to the formation of this museum are absolutely not over. We see those in the processes of institutional racism in an organisation like this, in higher education as a whole. We see it also in the distinctions which are drawn, and distinctions that started within anthropology in the 19th century in terms of making a difference in between one sort of a kind of person and another, and the sort of geographies through which race science and so forth were built. So there's absolutely that element which we experience on a daily basis in this space, and which is a part of what the Pitt Rivers is, and really one of those things where we can see here in this space there's something more visible, which is more generally true, I think, about higher education, and importantly about knowledge. So the objects in this, how we approach sort of restitution, and how we approach, or how we're starting to think about, debt, I guess, which, is if there are any anthropologists in the audience, debt, and that's actually one of the main themes that anthropology has used for thinking about objects, the notion of the gift relationship, but actually we've often not thought about the relationship of the taking, the relationship of those unequal relationships of, when things are taken through sort of coercion, when things are either directly taken through violence in the context of the punitive missions, which we see here. I mean, here we are on the lower gallery. Look over there, you're looking at the Benin case, which is the famous example in the far right-hand corner there, the most obvious example of objects which are taken with violence. But then also on the left-hand side, you've got the Cook case from the 18th century, so from more than 150 years earlier, where those experiences of sort of coercion and how things end up here are more complex, but certainly by no means is it okay that Oxford owns material from Australia and from elsewhere from the voyages of Cook. So how we try and think about those as a debt and sort of human relationships in the present is how, as anthropologists, that's our starting point in terms of how we think about any of these objects. These are in the present, and I guess the hope in some ways, the reason I took this job several years ago, and I think the reason that I passionately believe in anthropology as a discipline in the contemporary world, is that at its best, anthropology is the field that is there to bear witness to experiences from the global south, to an alternative to the Eurocentric creation of knowledge. And indeed, it's anthropologists that have helped us in some ways think through exactly what the legacies of empire look like, and how in some cases they look unlike how we think they do. They're all over the place in a whole set of complicated ways. So in this museum, those objects, they start with relationships, but they're not, and they are absolutely, they're about value, they're about money, they're about ownership. Our conversations with our colleagues in Nigeria, in the university museum sector, we find ourselves in a unique position. We're not national museums. We can offer, we can push these arguments further, and as an institution, we are trying our best, to listen and to lead some of others in the sector to think about these issues in a set of new ways. There's a pan-European conversation. It's an international conversation with sort of colleagues from institutions and source communities across the global south. So it's absolutely about restitution, such as we've seen in the context of the West Indies, around money, around scholarships, around how Oxford, and one really exciting thing about this week is that I think by the end of it we'll have learned more about how Oxford has benefited from exploitation, from empire and so on. At the same time in this museum, these objects are not only about sort of property, they're also about knowledge. So we are a university, and I think the politics of that knowledge and the politics of, in some cases that knowledge, those ideas relate to sort of belief, they relate to the ongoing presence of the ancestors, they relate to knowledge of a unique archive of violence. I mean, in many parts of what this museum is a great monument, to shame and to what stories that are actually uniquely archived in terms of what is written on objects, whether that is the appalling, racial language which is used, whether it's stories of how objects came to be here, whether it's actually not only the objects but the photographic collections which we hold. So I think we at the Pitt Rivers are thinking really, I think we're a key location for these conversations. We are we are also, though, I think, exactly like the conversation over roads, we are not a space that can be hidden or removed in any straightforward way. And I think the ongoing presence, the fact you're all here, the fact that we continue to rethink this. The Pitt Rivers Museum, and indeed anthropology as a discipline, is not over yet. It's had some horrible moments. It's had some absolute racists who have been involved in the 19th century, early 20th century in it. At the same time, I think we have to hope that these institutions may yet in some way offer spaces and voices and, if you like, a platform and some sort of privilege which we can use in sort of new ways in order to begin to make a contribution for the positive. So, I mean, it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful that the organisers this evening felt able to intervene, as has happened absolutely with the cases, this evening, and to be here and to use the space as a dialogue space. This isn't going to be a fast thing to solve, what the Pitt Rivers is, but I hope that as you're having your conversations this week, one of the contributions that we as the people working with and trying to make sense of how our discipline, which we think of as an anti-racist discipline, we think of as a discipline which can help us acknowledge diversity, we can have a curriculum that talks about sort of non-Western modes of thought and histories, and we can think about empire in distinctive ways, and we can start to diversify ourselves, which is in many ways one of the principal sort of challenges that we've got. I hope as you listen to the other conversations this week, and certainly I'll be listening a lot more than talking, as will my colleagues. I hope that the Pitt Rivers will at least offer a sort of analogy. You can compare your conversations elsewhere when we're thinking about Codrington's, when we're thinking, about, you had to walk in sort of today opposite Rose House. When we think about these other moments, let's also look at what's a bit less obvious. Let's use the Pitt Rivers as an index, as a rallying point, as a space for dialogue, because what we definitely know from our work with source communities over the years, which is only the beginning of this really, is that around objects and in museum spaces like this, you can have a certain sort of conversation which is really different to the conversation you have in a lecture room or in the House of Parliament or in the Oxford Union. It's a distinctive sort of space. So I hope that these objects, their stories, their untold stories, the horror and the violence, but also in some cases the hope, I hope that will help to frame some of your conversations over the course of the week. So thank you for listening.
The Uncomfortable Oxford Project, which is an initiative which kind of gets people to examine these issues, talking about the legacies of inequality, power and imperialism, and about the politics of memory within our built environment. And their project is hopefully getting us to have a better understanding of how to engage collectively with these histories in the public space. So we've got Olivia and we've got Chelsea, who is a content coordinator at Uncomfortable Oxford. I'm going to hand over to them and they're going to tell you hopefully a bit more about their project and how we can contribute to the conversation from their perspective as well.
Yeah, so just to follow up on Dan's very interesting presentation, there has been a lot of discussions about how it is the university's practical and intellectual responsibility to address how they have benefited from exploitation in the past and very recently in the news. You've also read that students in the University of Georgetown have suggested that from $27 will be taken from the student fees to fund reparations to slavery descendants, because the university hugely benefited from the sale of 272 slaves in the 19th century. And so there are different ways to address the question of reparations, and for our project, for Uncomfortable Oxford, we hope that through working tours, for this discussion-based working tours, we help people think about it and actually actively engage in those discussions and discuss with people they wouldn't necessarily talk to in general, people from the community, with academics, with students, people who don't necessarily interact on a daily basis, and also people who are just visiting Oxford and who have this very rosy vision of the city and the university. So for this short presentation, we've thought about how to think about the broader question, how has Oxford benefited from exploitation in the past? And we have 3 sub-themes. So first, imperial careers, second, imperial money, and third, imperial sciences. So I'll talk a little bit about imperial careers. With the development of the British Empire, lots of students at the University of Oxford found employment in the different British colonies. And it is the case in Oxford maybe more than in Cambridge, because in general, the Oxford University had a very special relationship with the British Empire during the high period of empire between 1880 and 1914. The Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary were usually Oxford men, and in the Indian Civil Service as well as in the Sudan Civil Service, Oxford men outnumbered Cambridge men by 2 to 1. So there is a very important involvement of the University of Oxford in the empire. And one college in particular took a special interest in the empire. It is Balliol College. So in general, throughout the 19th century, the students from Balliol College found employment in the British Empire through very large networks of alumni who helped them find employment there. And between 1888 and 1905, 3 successive viceroys of India were Archie, Balliol men, Lansdowne, Elgin, and Curzon. And Benjamin Jowett, who was a master of Balliol College, wrote at the end of the 19th century, "I should like to govern the world through my pupils." The feminine pendant of Balliol College was actually Somerville College, which sent more women than any other Oxford Women's College into the British Empire before 1914. So there's also, the Empire also provided employment for women. And going back to Balliol College very briefly, Balliol College also still hosts the Bate Professorship, and this Bate Professorship was first the professorship in colonial history, and it was established in 1905. And Hugh Edgerton, the first Bates professor, urged the need for a school of training at Oxford in the practical work of colonial administration. He was interested in the popularization of empire. He said, "Every school building is a citadel of empire, and every teacher is sentinel." And now the chair has been renamed the Bate Professorship in Commonwealth History, so there's a little bit of change that's happening, but it is only a very recent change. And now on to Imperial Wealth.
Hi, so I'm a beneficiary of the Imperial Wealth. speaking specifically, obviously, about roads, but there are several others. So I'm a Mandela Rhodes Scholar, which is a fund that supplies funding to African students in Africa to study at universities in South Africa. I was also a freelance journalist during the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall protests at the university currently known as Rhodes, which was named in honour of him, and then at UCT in 2017. So thinking about imperial money is quite interesting because it's about the perpetration and the perpetration of the imposition of a particular kind of intellectual capacity on university and tertiary university spaces and tertiary education generally all over the world. The university I did my undergrad at is known as Oxford in the Bush. Because the teaching systems are so similar, and the backing of people like Rhodes, Codrington, and in our neo-colonial times, Wafiq Said and Raymond Sackler support these kinds of potentially limiting knowledge systems. So. I don't think I'm going to need to dig into to Rhodes too much for this crowd, but and Codrington's been mentioned. But I think thinking about Wafiq Said and thinking about contemporary colonial systems and how Oxford continues to benefit from exploitation is quite important. So Wafiq Said is notoriously known for the Al Yamama. The arms deal, which, by 2005, so this information is quite old, 14 years old. They've made 43 billion pounds, off that deal. And obviously, the Said Business School is the major beneficiary there. And British Aerospace Engineering has perpetuated some of that financial neo-colonial, neo-imperialist exploitation, and then Raymond Sackler, I think, is known for Purdue Pharma and the opioid crisis in the States that is currently underway. Interestingly, the India Institute, the sort of last notable position I want to talk about, is an interesting opportunity to reflect on money that came from the empire for the education here. So a lot of the money that came to the Indian Institute was provided by people from India themselves with the intention of building some kind of government club and to allow for the building to become the preserve of the Indian civil service and probationers. So I think that that's an interesting way to think about how money perpetuates problematic knowledge systems. And I think that that's a way that Oxford has benefited and continues to benefit from the exploitation. And I think about this sometimes with my own positionality here, and I'm sure that many people here have a similar position, is that so many of us could be elsewhere providing our intellectual capacities to knowledge production systems elsewhere, but the reputation of the university as it's perpetuated by itself over time and through the financial support of these people has meant the monopolizing of intellectual capacity in this small and violent space.
And the third point I'm going to talk about, so we talk about imperial careers, imperial wealth, and well, I'm going to talk about imperial sciences because obviously Oxford is an institution for education, but it's also an institution that does a lot of knowledge production, and knowledge production is never an innocent endeavor. And some of the university departments were specifically created or redeveloped to help the management of the empire. So we talked a little bit about anthropology as a discipline. We talked about the Pitt Rivers. I'm not going to do any repetition because Van very well illustrated it. But two other departments that are kind of in this area of the city are also very good examples. So, for instance, the Department of Forestry, developed in the 19th century to help to manage the forests in India, because basically at this point Britain had kind of exhausted its natural resources in wood for naval construction. So in the 19th century it started relying very heavily on Indian teak. So the teaching of forestry in Oxford was prompted first and foremost in response to the needs of India. And interestingly, of all the 272 Indian forest probationers that were trained in Oxford in the years before the Indians' independence, only 2 of them were Indian nationals. So there are only 2 Indian nationals that have been trained into managing the Indian forests. And the other department that's quite interesting is the Department of Geography. Geography was founded by a man named Halford Mackinder. I'm not sure if you've heard about him. Still the chair of geography is the Mackinder Chair of Geography. And he's most famous for his geopolitical theory of Europe as a heartland. And Mackinder was an interesting character of the end of the 19th century, and he first became very famous for being the first Englishman to complete the ascent of Mount Kenya in 1899. And this was actually a propaganda move against German expansion in East Africa, and during this expedition he also repeatedly beaten and molested the black porters who were working for him, and eventually when a few of them tried to run away, he had them shot. So an interesting character, but who was also very deeply involved in this kind of competition for land in the African continent. And when he came back to England, he went on to become Oxford's first reader in geography, and that's where he developed his theory of the heartland, which can be summarized in those 3 lines. Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the word island. Who rules the word island commands the word. And in general, the Oxford geographers actively participated in and fueled the Imperial project, and geography as a science, as a field in the university was created because of the need to produce knowledge for the imperial decision makers. And we can see through those 3 teams that we only brushed over a few points because there is not a lot of time, but this is still present in contemporary exploitation, and exploitation in the past tends to perpetuate current hierarchies. And so there are a few other points you wanted to raise about current examples.
Yeah, so yeah, kind of leading on from the previous discussion and Olivia's mentioned here, certain things that we're thinking about, particularly if you're going into a postgraduate study or if you have the opportunity to become an academic. Many research grants insist that you can't pay academics keynotes, etc. for their time, only travel grants and accommodation. The UCU strikes are an example, I think, of Oxford exploiting its power. So the input of about 6, and this is Oxford and Cambridge, 16 Oxbridge colleges were given equal weight in the UK University Survey, contributing to the decisions which prompted the UCU strikes last year. As I've mentioned, the exploitation of the reputation, meaning international students pay exorbitant fees to be here, centralising and monopolising knowledge production. Living wage campaigns persist, as not all colleges pay the living wage, including mine, Wolfson, and many are not accredited. So if you can get if your college is paying living wage, try and get them to get themselves accredited. University exploits its power in this town for financial gain. Consider the Protect Port Meadow from Oxford University campaign regarding Castle Mill and the ongoing disaster that Castle Mill is. And then only last November, the Cherwell published the results of an investigation into the investments of Oxford colleges, finding that that the university colleges still invest heavily in fossil fuels. And I think that the next speaker might be speaking about that. So I think we'll leave that there.
Thank you.
Environmental justice and issues around climate change are near and dear to my heart, and probably all of yours as well, since it affects all of us. And it's something that there's a thriving culture of here at Oxford, because Oxford University, along with Cambridge, are two of the most massive institutional investors in dirty energy, in fossil fuels, things that we know are at the heart of the climate crisis. And there's this odd paradox where Oxford academically literally says that it is a leader on climate change in the world. We have academics here at the Oxford Martin School at the Climate Change Institute putting out groundbreaking information and studies on the level of carbon in our environment, on carbon capture, on movements forward, on what we can and can't do. And yet our university, our constituent colleges invest millions of pounds into offshore funds. So it was mentioned earlier. In November of 2017, The Guardian posted through the Paradise Papers a ton of information on how Oxford invests tens of millions of dollars in offshore funds, basically to get around paying taxes or bearing the costs that comes with being a charity. And many of these funds have direct exposure to fossil fuels, in particular through oil and rigging ventures. So more information about how to continue the fossil fuel industry. And then last year in 2018, the Cherwell came out with more information specifically about how OUEM's, the Oxford University Endowment Management Fund, which many of the colleges here at Oxford invest into, has a lot of exposure to fossil fuels as well as to other things like arms dealers, to tobacco products, to things that the university treats as very unethical, and yet our money, which is one of our biggest ways of speaking and powers of speech, are going to those directly. And so I represent Oxford Climate Justice Campaign. We are working to bring to light what these are. The information that's been posted in The Guardian and Cherwell is incredibly important, and we can't forget about this because it'll continue to lead to the destruction of our environment, which not only affects us, but affects us unequally throughout the world, especially when we think about who is going to be hit by climate change first. When we think about different studies coming out on the differences between a 2% warming and a 1.5% warming, a lot of those differences come with the global south being affected very differently from us when we think about who has access to resources to adapting to climate change. And action has to be taken now, so the continued pressure that we can put on our universities continuing to benefit primarily monetarily from these funds is super important. And so last November, we staged a demonstration that was called Divest, Disarm, and Decolonize Oxford. So this is a coalition that Oxford Climate Justice worked with other groups here on campus to try to talk about this exact exploitation that we are talking about tonight, about how Oxford, especially with its investments, many of which are really hard to find information on. Part of our campaign is doing freedom of information requests just to know what's out there. Many colleges don't respond. We have tried personally to get Christchurch multiple times, and they just will never answer. And so from the information we know, it's around $21 million that are directly exposed to fossil fuels. I have a feeling that number could be a lot higher. And so the more we talk about these things, and the more that we take a lot of action around this, the more that we can, one, know. Something that, as we talk to bursars and we talk to academics, many of which who look at us as younger students, as undergraduates, and just tell us that we don't know anything. I don't study economics, I don't have a financial background, so I was told, you don't know what the numbers are, you don't know what this means, you're not an investment banker, you don't know what investment strategy is. It needs to be secret. We need to diversify our funds across the energy sector. Those don't really mean anything to me if it means that we're in a climate crisis that we have less than 10 years to act on. And so, just to echo what has been said tonight, the importance of talking about what has happened in the past and talking about these colonial and imperial and exploitative legacies are incredibly important, but they're not over. In really any sense of the word, nothing of this is post-colonial, and nothing of this is post-exploitative. And so continuing to put pressure on what's happening now, and what will continue to happen unless we make a change soon. Yeah, thank you.
And Arthur, just to give you a bit of background, is an examination follower also at All Souls College. But he's also, he obviously talks quite a lot about the Codrington legacy and the link to slavery and the impact on the university to today. So we've got a five-minute contribution from Arthur, which I'm going to hand over to you now.
but I want to thank the organizers for putting this amazing event together, and hopefully I can say a few things that might be helpful, and I would love to hear what the rest of you have to say. So I was and remain a member of All Souls College, and as you might know, the Library of All Souls, which is this extremely lavish, beautiful building, was funded by a man named Christopher Codrington. Christopher Codrington, who was born in 1668, was born in Barbados to a family of slave owners, of plantation owners. And he spent some of his time in England, during which he was at Oxford and he was a fellow of All Souls College. And then he went back to Barbados, where he grew up. He became Captain General of the Leeward Isles, so he was kind of a sort of governor of that area of the British Empire. And importantly, his family owned 2 large sugarcane plantations on Barbados, where many slaves were kept. And when Christopher Codrington died, he left a lot of money to a lot of different places. But in particular, he left £10,000 to All Souls College, which was a huge amount of money at the time. And that is the money that founded the library. And he is known, the amount of money was so large that he is known as the second founder of the college. Now, what's strange about this history is not that it's unknown. So when I joined the college, it was always kind of discussed that, there's a statue of this guy in the middle of the library, and it says, that he was from Barbados. So it's not exactly a secret, but it was always sort of discussed a bit indirectly and slightly hushed. Sometimes we were told, oh, well, the money from the library came from the English estates of the family in Gloucestershire and not from the Caribbean, which in some ways is true, but actually that's not really what matters, because this was a family that really got rich from the exploitation of slaves in the Caribbean, and then using that money was able to buy these estates in England, and it was then that money that made it into the library. So even if it's indirect, it doesn't really matter. And I think what this mode of discussion suggested is that there was a lot of discomfort about this history. So in 2016, myself and Max Harris, who's another fellow at All Souls, organized a conference to bring together activists, scholars, members of the community, some of whom are on this panel today, to talk about this particular history and how we might deal with it. And I learned so much about this history. This is not something that I work on directly, but I learned so much about the painful legacy of slavery and how it continues to shape all of our lives, directly and indirectly. And I just want to share 2 things that I learned in this process about Oxford's connection with slavery that might be helpful for a number of you thinking about these problems. The first thing that I learned is that when we're talking about a figure like Christopher Codrington, or others like Rhodes, the debate often focuses on the morals of a particular famous white individual. And as members of a university and of a research community in Oxford, I think it is important for us to do the proper research into the historical detail of these characters and of the circumstances in which they lived in. I don't think that should be ignored. But then I think we have to ask really tough questions about what is the purpose of this detail. For instance, I found out that Codrington was indeed an unusual slave owner by the standards of his time. He wanted to educate his slaves, he wanted to teach them how to read, which was very unusual, and it meant that other slave owners did not like him. And this was interesting. But the thing is, though that's interesting to me as a researcher and as somebody trying to understand the 18th century, it doesn't really matter in terms of the consequences that this has in Oxford if Codrington was a good or bad person. That's not the point. I don't really care if Codrington was a good or a bad person. The question is, does this have the fact that he used people's enslaved laborers and that money is now used to fund All Souls College? That's what matters, not if he was good or bad by the standards of the time or of the standards now. And if we're doing research into the specificity of his life and his personality and how he behaved, we are obscuring the details of the lives of the people enslaved on the Codrington plantations. What about their dreams, their hopes, their personality quirks? Maybe some of them were better people and worse people. Maybe they were different in so many ways. And so I think it's important when we have debates about these legacies to pay attention to individual stories, but also to understand the fundamental structures that led to this process. And in a way, a name like Codrington and like the Codrington Library comes to stand in as a kind of symbol. But it's just the beginning of a process of understanding how this slave money ended up everywhere in this university. not just in one place, and how we might think to redress that structurally. The second point, very quickly, that I wanted to make is that when we were organizing this conference and trying to find out more about this history, as somebody who really doesn't know very much about this, is that I thought that the people in the college, and in Oxford more generally, just didn't know very much about this history. And they were just kind of, a bit ignorant. And that if they found out more about it, they would change their minds, because that's what happened to me. The more I found out about it, the more I sort of developed opinions about this. And this was the case for some people. There were some people that were very eager to learn and to find out more. But what shocked me more is how much certain people were willingly and willfully ignorant. Certain people who claimed to be scholars, who claimed to be interested in finding out the truth and in doing research, but actually who do not want to examine things when they are uncomfortable to them, and who will tell you in your face that they know things and then not show up to educate themselves when it makes them uncomfortable, and who have been told these half-truths about what it meant to be a slave in the Caribbean in the 18th century, and who do not want to listen when you actually do intense historical research to prove them that they were wrong and that they need to face the consequences of that in their lives. And so I think we also need to keep on making those people uncomfortable and to make them realize that this is a fundamental part of what living in Oxford now is about. So thank you really much, and I hope you have a great conversation.
The Black Caribbean Oxford community, we have got these loud voices who are trying to keep these spaces open, trying to hold up this mirror to have this conversation. And Junie's going to lead a workshop with the room to kind of get us to talk about, I'm going to be really clear what it is. The topic is about the connections of Oxfordshire's slavery, the slave trade and Windrush, bringing it all together into what's happening today and seeing that they aren't isolated incidents, that these are all linked into the conversations that we need to be having. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Junie.
In 2007, I don't know how many of you knew about the abolition of transatlantic slave trade. So we here in Oxford did a number of things, including holding a big ceremony service of remembrance to the ancestors at Christchurch. And I'm going to go back to Christchurch in a little while. So in addition to that, we carried a major piece of research into Oxford's connection or its links to slavery and the slave trade. We've heard about prime ministers, and politics is quite an important aspect of that. And in my initial sort of sojourn to find out about Oxford's connection to slavery and the slave trade, I looked at Oxfordshire rather than just Oxford, but people said, like Michelle just said earlier, why do you want to bother with this? That happened so long ago. I mean, it's gone, it's past. Let's forget about it and move on. But for people of African heritage whose ancestors have been enslaved, it's very difficult to move on because the legacy of enslavement is present to this day. Okay. So we go back to Oxford's connection to slavery and the slave trade. And what are they, people asked. And it's more than just people investing money in slavery. It's about how Oxford and England and Britain benefited from slavery. We've heard of Codrington and we've heard of all sorts, but somehow or other, Christchurch seems to be omitted from the discussion. And we go back to Codrington himself, who matriculated from Christchurch, it's the school, not the college, bequeathed his money to the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So Christchurch itself, which is where we had the service in 2007, was significant in terms of the monies from Christchurch, from the Church of England that goes to all the Anglican churches in Britain. Like, they had a massive. Codrington left, when he died, 800 acres of land in Barbados. That's what he owned. That's one island. He had plantations in Antigua and Barbados. So his reach was very far. He owned over 1,000 slaves. This is a lot for a small island, a lot of people. And he may well have educated them, but when he died, he left a legacy. And the Church of England branded each and every one of his slaves so that they were the property of the Church of England. That's the horrors of the history And that's the legacy that Oxford has. This Trister still stands. We've got All Souls College, which still benefits from his legacy and the money he bequeathed to Oxford. So that still continues to this day. We also looked at other aspects of Oxfordshire's connection to slavery and the slave trade. One of the most significant things we found was that between the years 1725 and 1807, more than 50% of prime ministers of England were graduated from Oxford. That's significant in terms of the policies that were implemented that ensured the continuing enslavement of people, the treatment of those enslaved people, the mere fact that there was very little being done initially to abolish slavery until the hiatus in the 19th century to abolish slavery, and that there are different schools of thought as to why that happened. So for you, I need you to think about, in terms of the past, the present, and the future, how that exploitation has enabled you to get to this place, to get to Oxford, and all that Oxford has to offer you in the future. You're the future leaders of the world. You're the future decision makers. So that's important, as far as I'm concerned, to ensure that that legacy is in some way obliterated, yeah? And that we don't live in generations to come having to repeat the histories of the past or the mistakes of the past. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of that. I mean, how many people knew of the connection between the Church of England and Codrington? No. One. Okay, right, you have the Codrington connection anyway. And that's important in terms of historians in the room to know that it's not just All Souls that has benefited from the Codrington legacy. It is more than All Souls, it's a lot more than that. Okay, I've given you sort of pretty much the details about the political connections here, but it's also the other aspects of the sort of like philosophical arguments that were put forward to justify enslavement and hence exploitation of millions of people, as we know, not just in the Caribbean, but in America. Because if we think about the Americas at that time, they were largely populated by English people from Britain, from England. And usually what happened was the second son, who was not the heir to the family's inheritance, would be sent off to make his way in the Americas, basically. And some landed in the Caribbean, some went to America, and some went to Australia later on. But this is how they got dispersed all over the place and built their empires, basically, which monies didn't stay in the Caribbean or America. A lot of it came to Britain. And until American independence, much of the money from enslavement went to Britain. It came to Britain to build Britain to be the nation that it is today. Yeah? So there we have a history of exploitation, a history of benefit, and a history of basically the rape of many countries in order to benefit the population in Britain. So we have the Caribbeans and masses of enslaved people going into the Caribbean to work on the slave plantations for nothing. And in the Caribbean in particular, Jamaica, one of the islands that we know statistically, if you were enslaved in Jamaica, your mortality rate was 7 years. You did not live beyond 7 years because the plantation owner believed it was preferential to work a slave to death and replace them, because it was cheaper to replace them and provide them with health care, decent food, and decent shelter. So that's the extent of the exploitation, which continued into 1833 when abolition of slavery took place, and the slaves were tied to a 5-year apprenticeship. We were told to enable them to earn their independence so that they could show that they could live independently without being dependent on the plantation master to provide them with all they needed to live. But revelation has shown that that's not actually the case. In Britain, the decision was to keep the enslaved Africans enslaved, to work an apprenticeship, which seemingly they were being paid to do, but they were not. It was literally to pay off the debt that Britain owed to the Rothschilds, who loaned them the money to pay off the plantation owners when slavery was abolished. There was a price to pay. You've heard about the 20 million pounds that was distributed to all the plantation owners. Yes, there was 20 million pounds, but it wasn't the British government or the British people who paid for it. All of the enslaved peoples on the Caribbean islands had to work 5 years as an apprentice, learned a skill they may have done, but they had nothing else, at the end of which they owed money to their plantation owners. Here you go, again you see the extent of exploitation of these people and their resources and basically their energy. So this is the level of which we are working on exploitation within the British education, the British political system, British economic system of exploitation. And when I go back to the policies that are being made, a lot of them were being made here in Oxford. You had people sitting in chambers discussing the rights and wrongs of enslavement, whether or not it was possible to do. The theologians who were saying that according to the laws of the Bible, it's possible to enslave someone, so it's justification for enslavement through biblical terms. So we have the biblical terms, the Bible being used as a tool to justify enslavement. Then you have the biologists and the scientists arguing that black people were only 1/5 human, so there were justifiable use of that method of enslavement. So you imagine a person being deemed 1/5 a human being and therefore could be treated as anything but a human being. And that's went on. And we look back, look forward and look at the present situation. The Windrush generation came to Britain after Britain's success in the Second World War. They came on the invitation to come and help Britain rebuild its war-torn country. When they came, they were not well received. There was nothing prepared for them in terms of accommodation and employment. Many of them found themselves unemployed and unable to find suitable work to match the skills with which they came to Britain. So here they were, exploited, and felt yet again that they were not being treated in accordance with what we would now consider being human rights, basic human rights were denied to them. And so there they were, 2018, we have the Windrush scandal. Again, you see the exploitation of a group of people who come here economically contributing to this country, and suddenly being told that all your rights have been taken away from you. You have no rights to healthcare, you have no right to education, you have no right to housing, you have no rights to benefits, and some have died in the process of that. Your right of entry, your right as a citizen to this country has suddenly been taken away. The majority of those people who came between 1948 and 1971 were British. They carried a British passport. Their births were registered. The census figures that would be gathered were sent to Britain. They didn't retain them in the Caribbean. They were all here in Britain. So if you want to find information about the Caribbean and its population, makeup, the demographics, it's right here in England. Not all of it available in the Caribbean. So these people come here and worked on the assumption that they would eventually have left Britain, gone back to the Caribbean within 5 years. But unfortunately for some, that goal had never been achieved because the difficulties of earning sufficient money, if sufficient money to save up and return to the Caribbean to build that better life that many came here for was not attainable. So what they did, they then bring family members over, they settled and remained here indefinitely, really. For some died here, like my parents, they both died here. And that's what happens to many. But the Windrush group that was highlighting the atrocities of the government's policies in 2018 showed how devalued these people were as contributors to the economic development of Britain, not only then, but in the past. And prior to 1948, where people came to Britain, worked, contributed to the economy of this country, and were basically told to go. Those who fought in the Second World War were basically sent back after the war with the intention to make a life in their home countries, but were unable to do so because of the economic unrest in the Caribbean at the time. You had the trade union movement who were raising up questions about the conditions of employment for people there, and therefore jobs were going as investment in the Caribbean was actually on the decline. Massive sugar production was reduced, so therefore people weren't able to get the work that they wanted to do to keep their families together, and England offered the opportunity, and England came out and asked them to come and help them rebuild Britain. But Britain was not the welcoming place they expected to do. They were coming to the mother country. The mother country was no longer a place of welcome. So this is the situation that we have between the connections of slavery or enslavement through to colonialism, through to neo-colonialism to the present day, that we have vast numbers of people come into Britain from different parts of the Commonwealth and other parts of the world, with disparities in terms of the sort of conditions that they endure, and the access that they have to various services in Britain. Oxford has a record of not actually accepting students from the African and Caribbean communities in Oxford, so they go elsewhere. So the brain shifts, the sort of brain drain from Oxford to elsewhere is ongoing. We're lucky in somebody like Michelle who's come back to Oxford and stayed rooted in Oxford, but most people leave, and London is the place of attraction with employment. So that build-up of skills and ability goes away from this centre where we would like it to be retained, so that people like Michelle and others can actually help build the community and build the sort of strength and obtain the sort of resources that we want. Yes, Michelle has mentioned Black Cultural Archives. We would dearly love to have a cultural archive in Oxford. It's this is an example of what could be there, and if we need to talk about how we can ensure that things go back to where they were, repatriation, an issue. We would say things could be here, but they could also be local, more accessible to people. Repatriation to their countries of origin. And if not, Senegal has built this fantastic museum just now to show that Africa is ready and waiting for its artifacts to be returned to the motherland. I hope I haven't bored you too much, and I hope I haven't talked too much, and I hope you gained something from what I've said. But if you want to learn more about Oxford's connection with slavery and the slave trade, there is a book that should be published at some time, and I can't say when. And lots of activities that go on in the community focuses around Oxford's connection to slavery and slave trade, and we are open to discussions and talking to groups. We can come and talk to you anytime you want. Direct you to resources that are available. I'm going to shut before my vision completely goes. Okay.
Time of Nazism, and I've noticed in Britain that there's this kind of divide and rule going on at the moment, where various groups of people, rather than working together because they don't see the connection, are desperately fighting their own corner. And I noticed that in the history of Nazi Germany, it didn't just happen overnight. It happened over years. And I think it's quite interesting that I think a lot of it has to do with racism, and I just don't mean black and Anglo-Saxon racism in regard to people from Asia. No, by Asia I mean not just the subcontinent, but there's this sense of we don't want these people here, okay? And I don't want to use that awful word Brexit, but that racism has been there for centuries, despite the fact that this is a very multicultural country for centuries. You know, there's no such thing as a pure English person, but I think what I'm trying to say, I'm still trying to formulate it in my mind, and I'm working on something at the moment called The Unchosen. And the people who decide that they're the chosen people, whoever they are, or their political group is a chosen group, means that those of us who don't agree with them become the unchosen. And I think at the moment there's this unchosen profiling going on. I don't know if this makes much sense, because I'm still trying to think it through, and it concerns me a great deal.
I'm going to ask any of us.
Thinking about, you know, the fact that maybe in the world we've been at a point where there has been the rise of fascism in a way which is not the same, but is, you know, comparable in some ways maybe with the world we find ourselves in at the moment. You know, I'd say, I mean, events like sort of this evening and the events, you know, the work that's happening over the course of this week is immensely important for a whole range of reasons, but I'd say especially because it moves the conversation forward so that more things can be said. It opens, it, you know, shifts the window of what is possible for us sort of to think about. And we've seen that in this institution, you know, really after Rosemas Fall. So Rosemas Fall fundamentally altered. I mean, the message of Rosemas Fall was that we could look at the built environment and we could have a conversation about institutional racism. Right? That was, you know, one of the things we learned. And so those of us in this institution who've been working here for a long time, I mean, actually, all of a sudden, Rosemas Fall opened that window further. It shifted the agenda, and I think the conversations we're having this week are also, you know, going to do something similar. Here we are in a museum which is part of the white infrastructure, as we've heard of, you know, how sort of Western thought has operated, and for all the reasons that we've heard from all the eloquent people who've sort of talked, you know, this evening, you know, these are absolutely urgent and sort of compelling, you know, questions. So absolutely, let's sort of think about the times that we're living in, exactly as was just said, but let's also realise that conversations like this really do make a difference, and they make it easier for, you know, they make things seem that they might be possible in a way that they didn't in the recent past.
Yeah, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the other countries that were part of the colonies, colonization of the British Empire, who were also being impacted on, but they're not being, their story is, because it's kind of seen as, it's quieter, because this is the year of the Windrush anniversary. And so that's one of the reasons why it's such a huge scandal. But this applies across empire and across the colonies, the colonization. I'm active in a number of political activist spaces where we don't just talk about one group, we talk about the impact on black and minority ethnic communities. And it's interesting to see that Brexit, I know lots of people don't like talking about Brexit because it's still so raw, but actually Brexit is a symbol of what a lot of black and minority ethnic communities have been experiencing for years, for centuries, and it's kind of brought to a head and put into the forefront the fact that there is this sense now that it's okay to be racist because it's okay to be xenophobic. It's okay to say, yes, we're leaving Europe behind because it's about this kind of sense of Britain being colonised. And we have to remember that's the language was used, the rhetoric around Brexit was Britain is being colonised and we don't like it. Now, for a number of people from countries that have been colonised and their wealth pillaged to build the British economy, we're standing there going, how did Britain get rich in the first place? Yeah, and the use of language, the use of kind of rhetoric is so important, because a number of people who voted leave or remain are kind of based on this idea of the British Empire back in the 1960s and 70s, don't realise that was a construct that they're talking about. And that's why I'm involved in education, because our young people aren't learning that. And I'm sure, I'm looking across the room and here and seeing how many people are nodding. You weren't taught that at school. You weren't taught the truth of empire and colonialisation. How can we learn how our present looks if we don't know what our true past looks like? And that's where we have to kind of keep that conversation going. Rhodes Must Fall was a dynamite blowing a hole in this space to create this space, and we need the next generation of university students and the next generation of community activists to keep that space open. Because I think Dan's kind of touched on it, is that this conversation will only stay open as long as there is still that agitation, there's still that space where people are willing to talk about it. And that's where we start to draw those links, we start to draw that intersectionality, but we can't do that if we don't keep that space open. And Rhodes Must Fall was not just about Rhodes Must Fall, it was about a wider agenda that hopefully we're starting to see some of the positive outcomes of it.
I'm at the very beginning of my...
Welcome.
Thank you. It's hard to settle. Yeah, I'm at the very beginning of my DPhil. And it's this kind of, the sense that people aren't sure where, well, the impression I get is the sense of a lot of the leaders have left. Big problem that all student movements have is that people age out. And the importance of a shift towards a climate concern, and how you can marry those two things, and how it seems to be, it's almost one or the other. It's are we going to talk about race, or are we going to talk about the climate, and who do you give your time to? Because I know how exhausting these kinds of protests and this kind of activism can be, particularly when people aren't listening to you. And so I'm just interested in hearing what people think about how we can bring together this question of resources, because Rhodes is about resource, right? He was digging diamonds out of the ground, and we are now sucking oil out of the ground, or the sea, and those things are not deracialized, and it's all, as has been mentioned, the global south is what's going to get hit hardest. Thinking about an example from home, they've found huge oil resources off the coast of South Africa, so I can't wait for my home country to be destabilized by the American government. Yeah, so I'm just kind of interested in hearing how people are thinking about marrying race and climate maybe potentially in a resource-based resistance.
Particularly, so I study environmental activism. The levels of invitation in which different people are invited to be part of that discourse, or if we think about who has led that before, the whitewashing of the environmental movement is really well known and really apparent even today. So Extinction Rebellion, which is a massive and new protest group that recently launched the International Rebellion to raise awareness and take action on the climate crises, based in London, but all across the world. I was there, and it was very decidedly white and very upper and middle class and upper middle class. And while it's great that thousands of people were at this protest, we need to think about who was at this protest, who felt invited to this protest, and what are kind of the dimensions behind that as well. And I think the more that we can address those questions, the more we can take further action on the fact that all of this is interconnected, and that in a climate crisis, which on a grand mass scale everyone will be affected by, the degradation of our environment does affect all of us. It won't affect us equally. And so something that hopefully Oxford Climate Justice has tried to do is we are in coalitions with other groups. We acknowledge that, especially from our specific focus on the investments of the university, that they don't just invest in fossil fuels, that arms trades, that there's colonial legacies that are still supported by many industries, that these things are all interconnected. A lot of it has to do with the lack of transparency in our institution around what it's investing in and where its money's going, and that, yes, absolutely, that these things are interconnected. And so I think having this conversation and having a space that will invite further conversations is incredibly important into then going to the next step of taking, connected and collective action on this.
I'm involved in the also Climate Review, which does a lot of journalism covering climate change, and I'm from Malaysia and also Singapore. And I think two things that I wanted to point out. The first thing is about visibility. A lot of the impacts of climate change are on the Global South kind of communities, and I think what Extinction Rebellion has done to that is that it's brought climate change much more immediately home to the UK, and you're feeling like, okay, climate change is actually impacting us, it's disrupting transportation in London, and it's made people a lot more aware. That's important. And also the historic dimension of climate change, because a lot of the emissions historically were from industrialization from the West, and I think there's a discourse, a conversation that needs to be had on that front as moving forward, what kind of solutions we can have and what kind of developmental progress we can have in different regions of the world.
Brilliant, thank you.
On Tuesday, potentially might be people from Extinction Rebellion there. I need to confirm that tonight. But if you're interested in these sorts of things, please come along to Common College at 6 on Tuesday.
It's open downstairs and is sort of free to go to. And so as a part of that, there's a series of events. I'd especially encourage people to think about attending the lectures from Nick Mizof, who is going to be here to give an Astor lecture on Tuesday the 21st and Wednesday, the next day after that. So that's in fourth week, on the Tuesday and Wednesday the fourth week, which is on the theme of what he's calling whiteness and the crisis. And this is really trying to make some links in between our conversations over national identity and displaced people in the context of environmental change and sort of conflict, but also the longer term conversations over museums and objects as well. So, they should be really, really great lectures.
Thank you. We have to pick and choose the priority. There's a hierarchy of what these discussions are, but actually, hopefully, from the discussion today, you're starting to see that they aren't exclusive, and there is a lot of crossover, and there is a lot of interaction. And it's our responsibility to keep that conversation going, but not be afraid to kind of dilute the conversation, not to dilute the issue by saying, actually, this links into here as well. And this is where we need to bring people together so that we can find our commonalities rather than our divisions, because as you say, it has been very much a divide and conquer. That was how the empire and colonialization got its strength, and slavery was divide and conquer. And so we've got to kind of get over that and see where we can bring these issues together. Before I finish up, and before I thank all of our speakers, what I would like us to do is I would like us to take a moment to just remember the ancestors. We are in a space here that has items that our ancestors and that the people before us interacted with. And there are those of us who believe that there is a part of them that is still connected to these objects, which may be something kept in a glass cage, but actually they belong to someone. They were a part of somebody's life. They are a part of somebody's legacy. And I would just like to take a really short moment for us to just think about the ancestors and those of us who have gone before. community, as you can see, are here, ready to support you. We are here to make sure, most importantly, you graduate. That's the most important aspect of it. We need you to go into the industries and into the areas of influence so that we can carry this forward. But we are here to help you to agitate, to act, and to help question and keep moving it forward. I want to thank Pitt Rivers for hosting this event. As somebody who grew up coming to this museum from a small child and feeling the energy that's in this conflicted space, you can really feel it. So I want to thank the Pitt Rivers for hosting. I want to thank Common Ground for organising such a brilliant programme of events. Hopefully, for no matter how short or how long your time at Oxford is, please do engage. Please don't feel that your own experience of Oxford is your lectures and studying, because there's so much more that needs to be learnt in this space of thought and engagement and thinking. And I'd also like to thank all of our speakers as well for giving your time and giving your insight and giving your expertise on this area. But I also want to thank you. Thank you for giving up your time. I know some of you have got really pressing lectures and essays and papers and research to go away and do, but I think this is valuable, and I hope you use it, and you use this time and use this space and your time in Oxford to think about what it symbolises to be in Oxford. So I do want to thank you for your time. Thank everybody for spending your afternoon, your evening with us, and hopefully we'll see you at more Common Ground events, not just this week, but into the future. So thank you very much.